Welcome again to Cherry Red TV. I'm Iain McNay and I'm talking with our Director of Catalogue, John Reed, about one of our new box set releases, C90. I'll go straight over to you, John. Tell us what C90 is.
C90 is the latest year-by-year volume which picks up the idea from the original NME cassette C86, which the New Musical Express put out that year to capture a certain sound that was bubbling up on the indie scene, which was a mix of kind of angular groups and jangly guitar bands like Primal Scream, Pop Release Itself and so on. So over the years we did a deluxe edition of C86, then we followed with C87, C88 and C89, and this is the next volume which takes us into a new decade. So what you get with C90, 1990, although it was just the start of a new decade, it was also a transitional year for indie pop or indie music, because it was in a sense the year that the major record companies really realised that the indie music mattered. And what's the point? Independent labels by this time had got their act together and they could have hits. So the concept of C90, as with the previous volumes, is that all the bands on disc 1 are new. They are as if the NME had compiled C90 at the time. And if you look at the lineup on disc 1, it's to die for, because at this time you had the whole Manchester scene. So you've got bands like the Charlatans, you've got St Etienne, you've got all of the bands labelled shoegaze, you've got Spiritualized, Slowdive, Lush, and the rest of them. So really it was interesting comparing C89 to C90. You really got the sense of the floodgates opening in 1990, and especially on the back of the success of the Happy Mondays and Stone Roses, who have appeared on previous compilations. All these indie bands were getting signed and selling records in big volumes. So it was an explosion at the time. You
mentioned St Etienne, of course that's a cover.
Yeah, cover of Only Love Can Break Your Heart, Neil Young. And they're, to be honest, they're closer to at that point to the indie dance thing that was happening, which we haven't really reflected too heavily on C90 because we try to keep faithful to the original spirit of it. But you've got a lot of groups on there that were really sort of picking up the baton. So you've got Manic Street Preachers with an early single, and you've got loads of really obscure bands who were really still part of the fanzine culture of indie, that were pressing up flexis, just selling records at gigs, regional record labels. A real kind of grassroots scene still existed. So that's coexisting with bands now signing to majors or being on big indies. One of the bands we couldn't clear for this was Ride, but they epitomised that era really, where they signed to Creation and they're pop stars. They're pretty boys. They've got Creation Records have got some money behind them. This is the year that Primal Scream breaks through with Loaded. It was an absolute explosion of groups.
And I've just lost my question there, so we'll cut that little bit out. I was going to go on to the story about Alan McGee signing Ride, but I thought that was irrelevant.
So, well, because they're not on there, yeah. But,
yeah. So I just realised that. So there's a lot of really obscure bands on here. How do you find them?
Well, I think that with the C series, certainly, we've actually had groups getting in touch and saying, oh, well, can we be on the next volume? So sometimes we just keep their tracks on file or their details on file. I think most of us involved in these projects, and I worked on this with my colleague Richard Anderson, we're fans of that music anyway. So we don't need reminding that the Faith Healers were this cool, scratchy little band on Too Pure. We think, great, we'll have to have a track by them. Or that Dark Side were one of the many spin-offs of Spacemen 3. We like Dark Side, let's get on to Beggars and license a track. Equally, we've acquired certain labels like Native Records, and that encourages us to listen to the nooks and crannies of the Native catalogue and find all these really obscure tracks by Raintree County or whoever, and think, oh yeah, we've got to have them on there. So, and of course in our own vaults, Cherry Red was still active as a contemporary label in 1990. So you've got James Dean Driving Experience on there. So I think a lot of these records we have on the subs bench, as it were. We know that they're there. It's not like we have to go looking for it.
Will there be a C91, do you think?
Always depends on how the previous volume sells, but C91 would be a challenge, because C90, there was this, on the one hand you had Manchester went massive in 1990 and then really kind of dissipated, and a lot of the shoegazing bands kept going through 1991, but then you had a bit of a nadir in indie pop in 92, where grunge becomes the big thing. So everyone's wearing plaid shirts and ripped jeans and trying to sound like Nirvana. So the British indie scene, this captures it at its zenith before it dips, and then eventually comes back in earnest 3 or 4 years later with Britpop. So it'd be interesting to see how the series evolves.
And when you say indie scene, one of my bugbears of this indie scene is, of course, indie is short for independent, and there was, in the late 70s, when there was a great boom in independent records which challenged the status quo of the majors, there was this great pride in bands being on independent labels, and that got kind of diluted over the years insofar as that a lot of the major companies started boutique labels which they pretended were independent, put through independent distribution, marketed in a kind of independent way. And I think this is a bit of a cross-section in a way, isn't it, of bands that are signed to majors who actually were promoted as independent, indie bands so-called, and then genuine independent labels that put out great music.
Yes, but most of the key acts, you had a rise of labels around 1990 that are either been around for a while, but their profile was increased. We mentioned Creation Records. There's a number of acts from Creation. Heavenly Records, started by Jeff Barrett, who'd been press officer with Creation, had a number of labels before. Cincinnati are on Heavenly, Moonflowers are on Heavenly. So the Beggars Group, Situation 2, Charlatans are on Situation 2. And Cherry Red, of course, as well, active with a number of bands on there, Avo 8, etc. So I think most of the tracks on there probably are independent, but I think independent labels were realising that they could benefit from, I think the cartel had gone down, or was maybe struggling by 1990.
Distribution network, yeah.
That's right, and Red Rhino had failed previously, maybe a year or two before. So I think it was an era when the independent music scene started to maybe use the majors for distribution, for manufacturing. They realised if they wanted to really compete and have major hits, as by the way Stiff Records had realised back in 1977, because if you have a hit, you need to manufacture huge quantities very quickly, and that affects the cash flow of any business. So I think that the indies started to use the majors, and the majors started to use people from the indies, from the A&Ring point of view. But I think the combination was productive, and you got a golden age in music as a result of it.
Okay, thanks very much, John.